brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
All right, guys. So I guess we are on our episode 41. And by the way, I have not even gotten 40 out there yet, just because I'm sure some of you are aware that I've been really, really unwell. So that one is pretty involved editing, but I'm hoping to get it out before, sometimes middle of next week. So we finished with the Australia and the neighboring regions. And to do that, we went really, really far back in time, all the way to the 60,000 years before our era time. And for this series, we're also going to have to start far back, though not quite as far. So everybody who is watching, again, this is episode 41. We are going to start talking about the history of the Caucasus region, which is a very fascinating region. And I cannot even begin to list the amounts of materials I'm going to be using. And I also want anybody who may be from that region to be aware that I am not politically inclined one way or another. So anybody who is from the area of Caucasus, whatever ethnical group, whatever peoples you belong to, whatever political affiliation you may have, this is intended to be absolutely apolitical. I'm not the foremost expert on Caucasus, obviously. Caucasus is a very convoluted and a very complex region that most people in the West know next to nothing other than Kim Kardashian, and only that because of Kim Kardashian. Some people know about Armenia. Unfortunately, the entire complexity, the entire fascinating history, the very complex dynamics of the different peoples who live in that region, have lived in that region, who originated from that region, who have vanished from that region, goes so far back in time and is so multifaceted and is such a heated topic for not just political but military discussion, for lack of a better term, right now, that I am approaching the subject with uttermost trepidation and uttermost respect to anybody who may be of that ethnic or national or historical origin. So that being said, what is Caucasus? Well, Caucasus is, I'm going to pull up some maps for you guys, because this, before we even start talking about Caucasus, I want to show what it is we're talking about, because it is very, very interesting. What I'm about to show you is a quick, basically movie of maps that show you different political and otherwise associations that have existed in that region since time immemorial, pretty much. And you've got to keep in mind that, first of all, most of these maps are not particularly accurate, because the further back in time we go, the more likely they are to be off, but even more so. And on top of all these boundaries and locations of particular language groups, particular peoples, they're in constant flux. I mean, they change almost every year. They go back and forth. A lot of territories are being disputed. A lot of territories overlap each other, and it just fluxes and changes. So this is what we're looking at. We're looking at basically from the top of the Caucasus, which has the Black Sea on one side, and it has the Caspian Sea on the other side. And Caucasus generally is divided, as far as ethnographically, as far as linguistically, into two areas. There's the North Caucasus, and then there's the South Caucasus. Now, before there were such country as Armenia, as Azerbaijan, as Georgia, and so on and so forth, those are the big ones that a lot of people are possibly aware of. Before there was such a thing as Russia or Turkey, before there were even such thing as Scythian tribes, Proto-Persian peoples, when the Persian Empire was still at its very early stages of being created, there were already states in this region. So we're looking at Caucasian mountains here. This is an ethnic map, and this is a very rough, leaving out majority of the actual ethnical groups and languages. Because if you start trying to present all of those, you're going to have a microscope sometimes to look at that. And again, they flex and move. So if we see there, I mean, the people that we're going to talk about today mostly are going to be the people in this group. And these are the people who are more or less native and autochthonic to this region. These are the peoples who are the direct descendants in one way or another of the peoples who basically came to be in this region. As you see, the language map and the map of the actual territories does not always match very well. Now, Georgia also includes in it Abkhazia, and they speak completely different language groups and even language families. So basically, anything that's on this side right here is not latecomers to the region. I guess people with the most roots, and I'm being very careful with how I'm phrasing this, are the people on this side right here. So we have our Abkhazian language group, and these are the peoples that are in the South Caucasus, mostly though through migration and various other situations that some of them have been shifted around. Kartvelian, and again, they only list here the Georgian language. There's about 4 different languages, at least 2 major ones that are on territory what is now Georgia, but they are very unique languages with their own origin. The Nakian language group, again, a lot of ethnic groups are completely excluded there. Now, Dagestan is a very small area, and it is right here. And within that small area, we barely have the very large ethnic groups and linguistic groups listed here. Most of these, this region breaks up. There's, I don't know, 50 languages. Sometimes people in villages neighboring from each other speak completely different languages. And this region has been a region where people always run away to whenever something happens on the plainlands. So I'm just going to go really quickly through the changes that this happens. So right now, this is a resources map during the Russian Empire, by the way. This is obviously a very resources-rich territory. Look at the changes. So we're looking right here about the year 1490 AD, okay? Now, 1405 AD, there's our wonderful Tamerlan right here rolling over all of Caucasus. There's our Mongols, or what's left of them. There's still Georgia. Trapezoid Empire is here. We go back a little bit further. This is 1380. And you see how much not only the borders of the different states and formations change, but the very nature of the states and formation. I mean, Alans is still there, Georgians is still there. And these people here in the Dagestan area, Lesky and so forth, they have always been there, but everybody else kind of ebbs and flows. 1311, but we jump back another just under 100 years. Again, completely different. Golden Horde is still here, and everybody's gotten shifted again. And this goes on and on and on. Kipchaks, right here, the nomads are coming up, right? Byzantine Empire is huge right here. This is what's left of the Persian Empire. New states pop up. Other states get moved one way, another way. Abkhazia right here is humongous, right? Here, again, we go back another couple 100 years, totally different picture. I mean, if you look at here's the Khazar Kaghanate right here, broke whatever is left of the various, Persian empires here, Byzantine Empire. I mean, and this is just, with each step, it changes and changes and changes.
I'm curious, is it land worth fighting for? Like, is it a lush place that's worth all these people coming in and conquering? Or
it's first of all, it's a gateway. Second of all, it's a safe harbor so anybody running away from anything happening on the flatlands generally found up there. And third of all, yes, it's very resources-rich territory. It is extremely resource-rich territory, and I'm going to show you a little bit. By the way, do you notice the state of Albania that keeps popping up? This is the Caucasian Albania, and there's much debate on it. Here's our, Scythian tribes. Here's our Georgia. I'm using, of course, modern days. Albania was a very major formation that disappeared when it was finally conquered, but they contributed greatly to the modern culture. Again, I mean, see it here, Armenia is enormous, right? Albania is still here. We're now back to AD. Bottom line is what I wanted to really show you guys is that this region has never been very stable in the sense of state formations and groups within the region were constantly moving back and forth, but most of them are very attached to their land. They're very partial to their land. Let me show you what this looks like as far as visually, what we're looking at, what kind of territory this is. Because it is a very lush territory with a lot of valleys, a lot of fields, and a lot of really tall mountains. and it's one of the most beautiful. I mean, I have a personal, very emotional connection with Abkhazia, which basically is a country that nobody recognizes presently except for Russian Federation and themselves. And I have some very tragic and some very personal memories with that region, and very partial and also very keen, very fond, very loving, very warm memories of those people and of that land. But this is what Caucasus looks like. I mean, very breathtaking, sometimes very severe, sometimes very complex. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth, and it is a tragedy that right now that should be a modern day mecca of tourism. But unfortunately, with everything that's been happening there recently, was the tragedy in Sukhumi that took place, was the constant tension and conflicts of, was the Chechen war. This is a beautiful region. My grandparents are from were living in the city of Grozny, and they managed to evacuate right at the start of the first Chechen war. I watched their house bombed on TV. City of Sukhumi, my beautiful city where me and my parents would spend, every summer. That was my pretty place with little palm trees. And I was a little girl, and and when war came there, we managed to get out of there soon enough. I lost somebody that was my first death in my life, and probably one of the first 3 victims in the Abkhazian Georgian conflict. The place where we were staying at, the resort that we would come to year after year, at the city of Sukhumi, the Dendrarium Park. First time the soldiers from Georgia came to the gate, the ladies, the cooks, they're large, mighty, how the ladies who in charge of the kitchen can be, they managed to chase them off with pots and pans. But you can only use so much pots and pans against men armed with guns. And so, yeah. And what happened there a couple of years after was such an absolute tragedy. It was a genocide that is rarely spoken about. And to imagine this beautiful, and for a longest time I had this dream, even though there's still war in Abkhazia, I wanted to go back. Sorry guys, I'm tearing up. I wanted to go back to that resort that we spent all those wonderful years at. And it was actually open to tourists for a while, but I just looked it up recently, last year, and the president took it for his palace. And because it's a territory probably the size of Yellowstone, of tropical or subtropical forest that was lovingly planted a couple of centuries ago by a man whose wife was ill with tuberculosis. And I will never be able to visit there again. And that's really painful to me. But anyway, it's a beautiful place. It's very welcoming, very warm people. Let me tell you a little bit about the people who live there and what kind of people there are. Now, there's so many ethnic groups there, and they're all very different from each other, but they all share some things because they have lived so close to each other for so many centuries, and in some cases, thousands of years, because they not only have communicated, but they also, a lot of them do come from the same origin. These people's languages and cultures are somewhat similar. Okay, let me go ahead and share and not screw up on sharing this time. But people of Caucasus are very unique people. If you have a friend who is from the Caucasus region and your friend invites you over to his house, I'm sharing, right? Be sure that there's going to be at least seven courses, even if this person is dirt broke. If you invite a Caucasian, friend, see, we use the word Caucasian here in America as something else entirely. But when I say Caucasian during this episode, I'm talking about population of the mountains of Caucasus and the surrounding region. If somebody from Caucasus invites you, comes to your house, be certain to make sure to clear off large table space, because he's going to bring beautifully decorated, foods made with loving care. Their cuisine is absolutely amazing. Very wine. They have hospitality laws. Right here, we're looking basically at and these are just the major ones. These are people called Abazini and Abkhazians. That's Abkhazia is the territory that I was talking about. Sukhumi, Avartsi, Agulas, Adigay peoples. These are the people from Azerbaijan. These and other Azerbaijani people, the Georgian peoples, which are very different and more Georgian peoples, Dargian peoples, Ingush and Chechen peoples are also some of the more ancient peoples that was their roots very deep back in time. Kabardin peoples, a nephew of mine. During the breakup of Soviet Union, his family was a mixed family, and he was a very bright boy, about 17 years old, walking home from school. And because of the ethnic conflicts in that region, somebody caught him and beat him into a pulp, and he hasn't been the same since. Armenian peoples. This is Lesgian people, some of the most ancient people, Ossetian peoples, Cherkessian peoples, Chechen peoples, Kumyk peoples, Kurds, but peoples from Bulgarian origin. There's also a lot of, and there's some just images of various people from Caucasus. I just picked out random pictures from the internet. I mean, there's a culture of dance in this society. There's a culture of military honor, of warrior code. There's a culture of being very respectful to your elders. There's a culture of defending you know, like a lot of people who live very closely to their traditions, they very, you know, if one of them gives you their word, they're not going to break it. It's one of them things. Beautiful women, absolutely stunning women, and the you know, the facial types, depending on which region you're in, change from basically what is Turkic or kind of to, you know, Turk peoples on the one side, and you have peoples that are absolutely unique in the center, and there are different types wherever you go. Now, some of this region is currently Muslim. Georgians and Armenians. Armenia had the oldest of all churches, Christian churches. Their Christian church is not related to any other Christian church. They predate even, I think, the Rome. I'm pretty sure they predate Roman conversion. Unique, beautiful, very welcoming peoples. There's, I mean, you know, there's an elder, for example, a father is responsible for all his sons and grandsons and great sons. And even if it's middle of Moscow and there's actually a couple of bandits, or, you know, a couple of big time politicians, or a couple of businessmen who are having a falling out, and they may be not only from different, you know, ethnic villages, they might be from even different ethnic and national groups, completely opposite, speaking different family languages. But if they have a conflict, then either one of the elders from either group either shows up or sends a message and says how to resolve the conflict. Both sides will obey. There's absolute respect for the elders in this culture. The men in this culture and all these cultures oftentimes prefer to do the cooking. They think that females should probably not be trusted with such an important task. Dance takes a very, very big role, has a very big role in these cultures. Now, these are people that are probably, you know how there are click languages in Africa? Well, in a lot of the Caucasian languages, again, I'm using the word Caucasian, only referencing the population of Caucasus, they have other sounds that I'm not going to attempt to reproduce for you, but they have very throaty, kind of sing-songy set of consonants that you can always tell somebody who is from the Caucasus because of how they're speaking. It's different kind of speech. Those sounds are just as unique to that region as the click languages are to Africa, and they likely are just as ancient. In a lot of the languages that are believed to be some of the oldest ones, there are very few vowels in the language, but a lot of consonants. So you can have a word where you have 6 consonants in a row, 1 vowel, 5 more consonants, 1 vowel, 10 more consonants. I mean, it's because they have so many sets of consonants. They don't only just have the, you know, the separation that we have between, I'm not sure what the linguistic term is in English, but there's the kind of, I'm going to just call them bright, like n. And then you have kind of quieter ones, like more hushed ones, like h. They also have another set, and they oftentimes double or triple them up. So very different language, very unique language. The people from Caucasus, if you know what people from Caucasus look like, you will never be able to mistake them for anybody else. They are very mighty. Some groups are more larger than the other ones, but they have a very specific, very unique, very noble appearance. And actually the story behind why we call
I can remember going to a Scottish ball in Montreal, and the Armenian community in Montreal was having a ball or a dance, I guess, in the next ballroom. And a lot of them were in their national costume, and the women were beautiful, and the people were really interesting. But some of them, because it's Montreal and the big city, and they were all dressed in very modern with lots and lots of makeup, and they didn't look good at all. They looked better than that. They're in their national costume. They were fabulous people.
Right. And right, no, I understand. No, Armenians are wonderful. Georgian people, I mean, my love, my heart goes out to the Georgian people. It is a tragedy that right now there's tension between Russia and Georgia, because throughout history, those two cultures have been very, very closely tied together. The tragedy that is happening in Abkhazia is still happening in Abkhazia, has been happening in Abkhazia since 1989, I think. was the year that the first outburst of that military conflict that drags on and on began. I mean, people, I'm not going to get into the political part of it. Bottom line is, these are people who are welcoming, who are brilliant, who are honorable, who are extremely bright, who are proud peoples, all of these peoples. And the fact that they have been put at each other's throats the way that they have been, to me, is just an absolute disaster and tragedy of enormous scale. Now, the Armenian population in Caucasus, most of the population in Caucasus, one way or another, of course, had a lot of admixture from incoming refugees. For example, when Persia fell, Persians ran and joined the Armenians. When Hittites fell, whatever was left of the Hittites ran and joined the Armenians. Some Semitic peoples, so on and so forth. So
it's where the Neanderthals first mixed with the people that came after them. So that's definitely old roots.
Right, and with my love of Neanderthals, I'm very tempted to say something that I'm not going to say, because again, no, you're not going to say it either, because I don't want to be very much offending peoples of the region. But they do have very unique morphology that is absolutely awesome, and they just have you will kind of like, it's called an eagle profile. Now, Armenians are mostly Indo-Europeanish, their language at least is, and their appearance is very much towards. They're not typical representatives of the Caucasian peoples, but they nonetheless have been there for so very long, and their roots go so very deep that it's almost impossible to say which peoples are first. Okay, hold on, I have one thing that's in the wrong thing. So I'm going to show you a couple of maps. So in order to talk about this very complex, convoluted region, so that by the time we get to the modern complexity, you kind of understand what it is we're talking about, we have to go all the way back. We're going back to the summer Akkadian times. Okay, and we're starting with the people known as Hurrians in English language, peoples who are very rarely talked about, whom we have brushed upon very briefly when we were discussing the Hittites, early Assyria, and Sumerian civilization, and all that lovely stuff. Well, at the time when all those things were happening, there were other peoples and other powerful states that also interacted that we sometimes hear about in passing, such as Urartu, which in a way is a precursor to modern day Armenia, but we all oftentimes hear about peoples like Hurrians, like the Hatti, like the Caucasians, there's a lot of those groups that became eventually the substrate for the Hittite Empire, for Mitanni, for Urartu, for example, was at war with Assyria until Assyria fell. Back and forth battle. Urartu was an enormous and mightily powerful state. And among all these peoples, there's one thing, a lot of them go back to the same language group. So there's a lot of, it's hard to prove, but there are a lot of hypotheses and a lot of suggestions and evidence that the modern Caucasian languages, and I'm not talking about the newcomers in the European or Turkic languages that evolved much later, but the original local languages, that they were very much closely associated with the Hatti, Kask, Hurrian, and those groups. And if you remember when we talked about the Hittites, that Hittites were in the European layer that admixed with the local Hatti substrate, and their own Hittite self-title Hittite actually came from the word Hatti, though these were completely different groups to begin with. Well, in the same way, the Hurrian peoples, they were not as prone on forming large states. They formed a lot of smaller states, but they did serve in the genesis of one of the very big states, and that's Mitanni. And so who are the Hurrians? And we have so much stuff to talk about today, and I'm just going to try to shoot my way through it. Well, they most likely, these are people who are part of the Caucasian group of peoples who originated somewhere in the Caucasus. And they migrated, starting 4000 BC, they started migrating down into the plains, into Mesopotamia, and interacting with the Sumerian civilization city-states. They have taken up modern Syria, Palestine, North Mesopotamia region, and they settled there. Now, the land there was fairly fertile. And so they were not as pressed to build irrigation as some of the other peoples in history have been. So they had much more, their social organization, when they did form into a social organization, was not as much governed by the need to organize to build irrigation systems, the need to create complex bureaucracy in order to manage these works that involved thousands and thousands of people. It was more individualistic, more community, like local farming community based kind of formations. And it is hinted somewhere that they oftentimes were hired by other major states' rulers as their bodyguards. And so they, just like Vikings later on with the Byzantine Empire, when they served as the bodyguards of Byzantine emperors and learned a lot about statehood, I suspect that these guys in the same way picked up a lot of knowledge about how you manage a large state in order to make people cooperate with you and do things correctly. We have fragmentary information about the Hurrian people on the one hand and enormous information about the Hurrian people on the other hand, because Akkadian texts, Hittite texts, very Semitic texts, the Bible for that matter, Egyptian texts, Assyrian texts, there's constant appearance of these people under one name or another in those texts. They referred to differently, but these are the people that you never hear about in your history class. And yet things like, for example, introducing horsemanship and introducing the idea of a war chariot to the Mesopotamian region is very likely somehow associated with Mitanni. Concepts like the famous bull-headed statues of Babylon, that's a god that originated with the Hurrian pantheon. That's their pantheon. The story of the Greek gods, where the son castrates his father and then another son overthrows his father, that famous and familiar story, that's actually has its origin in the Hurrian mythos. Hittite gods, they are Hurrian deities oftentimes. And our beloved, lovely, war and sex-loving Ishtar is actually also a Hurrian goddess. Israel was somewhere where they were also intermixing a lot with the Semitic people, and there are even some suggestions that they may have founded the city of Jerusalem. These are the people from whom it is believed that the idea of Eve as such, Eve as the Eve and Adam in the biblical story, has originated. Some traces of the Gilgamesh mythos is also in their original mythology. So there's so many things that likely come from, or at least in some way were influenced by the addition of these people to the local civilizations. They interacted heavily with the Sumerians, so there's a lot of crossing back and forth with the pantheon and religious practices and the worldview. They interacted heavily with Akkadian people, so Semitic worldview practices and rituals are very much also intermixed. These are the people who some believe may have, these people or people like them from the Caucasian region may have been the vehicle for transmitting the idea of alphabet to Phoenicia to begin with. Now that's debatable theory. And there are even some people, and this is a very marginal theory, who claim that the concept of Anunnaki is actually referring to these people because they were a lot more advanced oftentimes than the tribes in the valley, basically on the flatlands, and because Caucasus was one of the centers of development of metallurgy. The Greek tell the story of the Golden Rune, that where they're talking about the modern Georgian territory. Prometheus is originally a Caucasian region national hero. It's a hero god that is chained to a mountain. Prometheus is not a Greek deity. It is a deity that was imported from that region. So very, very important peoples. I'm going to stop and let somebody else jump in.
These people in general, the entire region, the older, parts of the story, they were pretty proficient with horses, were they not?
So here's the thing, because if we remember from our discussion was about Hittites learned a lot of their horsemanship from the Mitanni people. And there's specifically one, it's basically instruction manual on horsemanship and horse husbandry that is directly, and even Hittites assign the origin of this to the Mitanni people. The Mitanni state is kind of it's kind of a standalone among the older. Hi, sorry. Cleaning peoples, but they are unique because unlike other Hurrian peoples who oftentimes mixed in with Semitic peoples, their language is kind of interfused with the Semitic Akkadian languages, with the Sumerian language later on, was all those languages that they all used the cuneiform writing, of course, adapting it to their own language needs. But Mitanni people, it seems that that wave of migration came along with the Indo-Iranian wave of migration, and that a lot of the they were almost intermixed. So it's a big question whether or not it was the Indo-Iranian peoples that brought that horsemanship and chariot with them. The rulers of Mitanni, and I was going to talk about later, oftentimes usually would have Indo-Aryan names, and all the terminology they used for horsemanship and horse husbandry was also Indo-Iranian in origin, while a lot of common terms for rituals, for religion, for everyday life were Hurrian. So it is highly suspected that horsemanship skills and knowledge most likely acquired when those two different types of people merged in the process of migrating to the region. Does that make sense?
Basically, when these people mixed together, they learned a lot from each other, and the horsemanship was brought in mostly from one side, not the other. I mean, am I getting that about right?
Right. But because by the time they got to their final destination, they were so tightly interwoven, it's really hard to attribute it to one side or another. Traditionally, historically, it's been always attributed to the Indo-Europeans and the Iranians. And I'm somewhat partial to that theory, just because if you follow the breadcrumbs, that's kind of where it leads. But that's a highly debated subject. I mean, I'm very reluctant to bring up, with all my love for Neanderthals, I do not want to be labeled as somebody who is very inappropriate and politically incorrect. But I mean, the idea of having a strong Neanderthal admixture and Neanderthal cultural influence on certain populations in the world, to me, is extremely appealing, because I happen to really like Neanderthals. Other people might find that offensive. But David was kind of pointing to that. There's some very, very unproven guessing theories whether or not certain languages were influenced by certain groups. For example, the tonal languages of Asia may have been influenced by the Denisovians. And there's some people who suggest that the guttural sounds in some of the Caucasian language may have been a Neanderthal influence. There's a lot of disagreement among various linguists. I mean, there's a couple of Russian schools of linguists. Starostin, one of the most brilliant linguists of last century, and his son, they both lean towards the idea that some of the languages of modern Caucasus are closely related to the Basque languages, which would extend the influence of those people all the way out to that region and make them basically the original population of Europe. But that is a theory that is very strongly debated by other scientists. And even as far as the Pelasg in Greece and Etruscans, that if we buy the idea that the Basque and some of the Caucasian languages are closely related, then you can draw that parallel further all the way down to the first settlers of Crete, to the Etruscan peoples. But those are theories that have not been proven in any way, shape, or form at this point in time. But they do exist, and I don't see them as something that is out of this world, if that makes sense. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead, because we're running out of time, and run through the Hurrian information really quickly, though I have a ton of it. So Hurrian peoples, they tended to form city-states. So when we're talking about the Hurrian people, we're taking Mitanni as kind of a unique formation because of the intermixture and strong influence of the Indo-Aryan element. They kind of behaved not like most Hurrian city-states did. Most Hurrian city-states were they were city-states that were centered around a specific cult. They did not have a single pantheon. Each group or each city-state would have their own pantheon with some variations. They tended to be governed by kings of some sorts. Throughout their existence, the Mitanni people caused a lot of headaches to the Hittites. The Egyptians conquered them, then unconquered them, then conquered them, then unconquered them. Hittites conquered them, unconquered them, conquered them, unconquered them, and took upon them many of the customs. I mean, Assyria at one point in time was conquered and subject of Mitanni, which we know how well that went in the end when Assyria managed to climb out. When Hittites were taking Babylon, the Mitanni people were right alongside, in for the joy and fun of looting and raging and taking away all the niceness, except when those respective sides got back, they realized that they had problems dividing the gold, as oftentimes happens when you have multiple people participating in acquiring of expensive resources. They were fairly sophisticated as far as their organizational, society organization, political organization went. They were their culture seems to have been centered around what we would call a palace, but really these were like citadels. So kind of similar to the palace in Crete, but smaller scale than that. Military was subsidized by the state. Only state had monopoly on working metals and selling and purchasing metal objects. They had the monopoly on weapons. So all the weapons would be stashed in the palace, and all the armor would be stashed in the palace. And all the food in case of war would be stashed in the palace. And the only thing that the warriors themselves were expected to be in charge of were their horses and themselves. But so in case of war, they immediately got summoned to the palace and handed out those resources and given provisions for the specific enterprise. Because the land was so capable and gave such good yield, farming was one of the major activities of the common folks. Another major activity, not just of the common folks, but even within the palace itself, was making of fine wool clothing. And the trade of this clothing was monopolized oftentimes by the state when it dealt with outside entities. What's interesting is some of their very rich and very famous merchants even were slaves to the king. But the slaves in this case are not the kind of slaves we've typically think about. Oftentimes these were very skilled workers. So within a palace, you usually would have a king living, and then queens would have their own households, their own little palaces, and their own military detachments wherever they lived. But before they reached the age of maturity, princesses and princes lived in the palaces, certain number of guards, and then we have so many wool makers, so many iron workers, so many smiths, so many fine craftsmen seem to have been housed in the palace with the nobility. Even though they were technically slaves, they were less slaves and more, I don't know, like in the Soviet Union, when they would come take very valuable physicists and chemists and put them away in a kind of a compound where they get treated well, but they can't leave so they don't spill state secrets, that kind of slavery. There was another interesting thing with a lot of these states. It was illegal to sell your land. In other words, nobility formed by A, having horse, knowing how to use that horse in war, and B, having grabbed a piece of land when they originally came there. But that land was not something that could be ever sold. So always had to be split. There were laws on how the land was split among any children or any male children that the owner may have had. So this oldest son always got 2/3, and then the other ones got whatever was left divided in equal or so amounts. What that led to eventually is that, as these big sections of land started getting chopped smaller and smaller and smaller, people got into desperate poverty. But it's illegal to sell land. You cannot sell your land. It's not possible. And so they would have very interesting little tricks, like, I'm a really poor nobleman with like 5 meters by 5 meters and itty bitty plot of land, and I don't have anything to eat. So I'm going to go to a more successful neighbor, and we're going to make an arrangement. The neighbor who's wealthy is going to adopt me as his so-called son, and then as my adopted father, he now has access to my land because he's now a family member. And that way it's kind of selling it without selling it. It's one of those things. And so a lot of people who were originally quite well off started very rapidly getting less and less well off, while the richer owners of land tended to consolidate their properties and become richer and richer. So that was one of the unfortunate aspects of their culture, the way things got handled. Oh, they even had as much as administration and the palace that administered the region. They administered laws. They administered any serious. They mediated any serious tensions between various noble families. But they had such a position as, for example, Saki and Mat, which is similar to today's minister. They had people who would be the commandants. What's the word for it? Commandant of a fort, the commander of a fort. So they would have military forts out, and they would have official nominated, representatives there. They also had things like city mayors. So they had pretty advanced, on the one hand, a bureaucratic system, but on the other hand, the king didn't tend to get, even if a territory was considered to be a part of that formation, the king did not tend to stick his nose into their business too much. I want to pull up just a couple more maps just to show you where these people are. Well, if anybody has a question, please jump in. Okay, so I just really quickly want to show the Hurrian spread here, and then David wants to jump in. I just have 3 maps here. So the area that is in yellow right here, so this right here says Mitanni. This right here are other Caucasian tribes, and that's very seriously debatable. This is another Hurrianish formation, but all this region right here that's marked in yellow, and Mitanni is in green, but right here in yellow, that's where various variations of the Hurrian languages were spoken. These are some of the more important city centers. Some of them we have never been found. As you see, Assyria right here is within the area of influence of the Hurrians. Hittite peoples are here. I mean, so this was a fairly big formation for a while. And then, of course, and then again, just another, because it's not very clearly known exactly where they were located, but if you can just tell by looking at this, that this entire, Subartu, by the way, means the same thing as Hurrian. Subartu is just what people of Semitic origin happen to refer, people in the Bible actually specifically happen to refer to the Hurrian people as. Everybody else calls them Hurrians, and people in the Bible refer to them as Subartu people, but it's not currently used in discussion. But anyway, a lot of their cities, these cities were right under their control, or at least linguistic and cultural influence.
The original language group of the Caucasus apparently spread very, very wide, possibly all over the Anatolia, and it was probably, we're talking about 8,000 BC.
Yeah, no, it's very ancient.
It's very ancient, and it's very likely that it spread up the Danube Valley into Europe as the first farming peoples of Europe.
It's possible.
It's possible, at least.
Yeah.
The connections to isolates like the Etruscans and the Basque could be fundamental.
So I just want to give you really quickly an example of what population of one palace was that we have records for. So the population was 6 princesses, 5 princes, 83 slaves, 32 were makers of fabric. There were 3 metal workers, 3 smiths, 2 pot makers, 4 scribes, 2 basket makers, and a cook, a baker person, a person who made beer, a couple herders, and some gardeners. Okay, that's your population. Yes, it's a population of a palace. So it's kind of one of those kings who milk their own cow and work their own fields oftentimes, as we see, for example, in Homer's Iliad with the Greek kings. They, as I mentioned before, they have heavily influenced the mythology, even of Greece and everything that came to us down the road. Their first mythology suggests is so much centered around mostly hunting and much less agriculture, that it seems that they originated as obviously as hunter-gatherer peoples, but they already knew the practice of agriculture by the time they came to the region. And they had, just like Greeks, or rather Greeks copied from them, or probably were influenced by them, these different generations of gods, where the first generation, the very ancient gods, were forced underground, and that's your...
It's Tartarus.
Tartarus in English. Tartarus, that's right, because everything is Latinized. I keep forgetting that. So there's that idea, and those gods only got called upon, and they were considered to be fallen dark gods, and they were only called upon when people felt like some sort of a curse or some sort of a travesty or filthiness was placed upon a territory, and those are the gods that they would appeal to take that away. And then they had a couple of generations of subsequent gods. As I already mentioned, dear Ishtar was actually a big-time goddess in their pantheon, and her name was Shavushka, and she's an equivalent of our lovely biblical Astarata, and also of our lovely Ishtar and Inanna. All of those goddesses, they are very closely linked, and it's a big question whether they originally originated at Sumerian or Semitic or the Hurrian mythological pantheon. They did have the father of all gods, which is Kumarbi, who also got overthrown by his son, just like it happens in the Greek mythology. And their main top god is the god of thunder, which later became the head of the Hittite pantheon under a different name, of course. And his name was Teshub. And Teshub was represented as riding a 4-wheeled chariot with 2 bulls. Sounds a little bit like Viking mythology, right? As Nordic mythology later on. But there's these crisscrossings everywhere. He was the god of thunder, the god of basically our Mitra later on kind of got intermixed with him in the Indo-Aryan tradition. There's mythology, there's certain female characters, not so much deities, a female character that is sometimes associated with the idea of Eve, and I assume that that would mean there was also an Adam. But a lot of these traditions are really, they have really far.
Right.
Oh, by the way, an interesting fact, you know the famous Mount of Ararat, where supposedly the Ark was crashed and where people keep digging, trying to find it? Well, they're digging on the wrong bloody mountain. The original mountain of Ararat, and that is likely also Hurrian or related language. Those languages, early languages, have a tendency to be what today is called the banana languages, when you have repetitions, inana, Ararat, all those kinds of languages. It was a different mountain altogether, so they probably should figure out where the original place where it would have crashed been before they start trying to find various old pieces of wood and claim that they are the Ark. Yeah, I mean, these guys are just really are huge influence on everything. And what happened when the kingdom of Mitanni fell is that peoples, the substrate, got absorbed by the surrounding tribes. They didn't disappear. Their language persisted in the region for a long time, and really only starts vanishing with the collapse and the complete destruction and disappearance of the Hittite Empire, because they were so closely. They had rituals. Their rituals heavily influenced the rituals, like their cleansing rituals. For example, shooting from a bow, and shooting arrows from a bow to strike down imaginary or spiritual opponent. The idea of certain hymns and those kind of just different ways of that they would sacrifice animals during their rituals. The whole practice of telling the future from the flight of birds and all that stuff is also mentioned among the Hurrian peoples. And the idea of the scapegoat in our culture that came to us from the Semitic, from the biblical sources, as being avatar of Azazel, to where it's a goat that Semitic peoples would take and place all their sins upon and then kick it out into the desert to die. That practice also originated in the Hurrian tradition. We have some of their literature, but unfortunately the amount of texts that we have we have a lot of bilingual, trilingual, Hittite, Akkadian texts. We have letters and the correspondence between the pharaohs of Egypt and some of the rulers of Mitanni, because those two states were at war for about 100 years. Then they made peace. Then one of the daughters of one of the most successful Mitanni kings wound up marrying the pharaoh of Egypt, who promptly died. And his son came to the throne, and we'll remember who that son was, because that's our unforgettable, reformer of religious ways and creator of our own new cities. And so this is from the Armana repository of texts, and that's a letter when the new king of Mitanni is writing to the new Echnaton, who has just stopped worshiping everything that his ancestors ever worshipped, saying, "What has happened to you? We just made peace. We were such good friends. Why cannot things be happy between us again?" But Echnaton was not so interested in foreign policy at the time. And then Mitanni fell under yet another Hittite assault. Hittites and these guys were at war 24/7, 365 days a week, or however many there are. I mean, the Mitanni and Hittites pretty much was at war, in endless, continuous war. Well, the Assyrians finished. Hittite was already finished off with them, the strong state formations, but the population mostly got completely absorbed and chewed up by the Assyrian Empire. But yeah, these are very unique, very influential peoples, and they are, together with the language of Urartu state, which we will talk about next, which is in the modern day Armenia area, they form what's today believed to be a joint language family, kind of to where they separated enough to be two completely different languages, but they do have the same origin. And some theories do suggest that the modern Abkhazian, some of the modern South Caucasian languages, such as Abkhazian, such as Adig languages, may have their origin in a similar type of, at least be distantly related. But also do some of the North Caucasian peoples believe to be related to them. And they are very proud to be part of this World Heritage, really, and as they well should be. I'm going to stop here. I just want to share a couple more pictures on this whole story because I have some of the images of their art. We don't have much of their architecture left, but we do have quite a bit of text and that are easily readable because of the fact that they were using cuneiform. And also we have quite a bit of their texts that are embedded into other texts such as Assyrian, Babylonian, Akkadian texts, and all those other lovely cultures that we know and love so well. This is more like it. One thing, if you notice on the profile here, do you notice the noble eagle nose? That's you oftentimes see that on Hittite representations because this is the most famous and one of the oldest finds regarding the sculpture, and it's a lion statue. This is what their writing looked like. As you can see, it's cuneiform, but it's an adapted version of cuneiform. Do you remember when we were talking about Zostrism, this idea of winged symbol? That is, it originally was one of the primary symbols of the actual Hurrite peoples. This is drawing of one of the panels. Again, very early stuff. Language, they also had hieroglyphs. They had another writing system that was hieroglyphic. And this is some representation of the warriors. I mean, you can see where a lot of the Babylonian, Assyrian, traditional cultural aspects really take their origin from these peoples. And that's why I thought we would start with them, because once we go with these very ancient people, the Hurrian, the Hatti, the Urartu, which is huge, all of those other people around there, then based on that information, we can start piecing together the very complex mosaic of different tribes, populations, and peoples of modern day Caucasus. This is written by a very patriotic person from the Caucasus. He's a somewhat controversial figure, but I do believe that these particular theses, they are probably, from everything I know and observed, pretty accurate for most Caucasian peoples. And this is the code of honor or code of conduct of a true Caucasian person. A true Caucasian is responsible for all of his own actions and all the actions taken by his children. His word is unbreakable. A true Caucasian knows very well the history of his peoples and studies the great deeds of the sons of his peoples. This knowledge will give him strength and patience to overcome difficult periods of life. A true Caucasian knows his own language, his traditions, and culture of his peoples. A true Caucasian remembers that good times and bad times in life come one after another. A true Caucasian is not measured by the amount of his wealth, but only by his own courage and valor. A true Caucasian is convinced that honor and dignity cannot be bought or begged for. One has to earn them every day. So, I mean, these are people, these seem to be very common values. But the thing is that in the societies, like the different societies of Caucasus, these values are still kept, and they're much more original, much less convoluted and much less watered down form. And the people from Caucasus are truly very old school, what we would call old school, really something that we're starting to lose today in our European civilization very rapidly. So, I mean, like I said, these are very universal and yet very crystallized within these societies, these cultures, values. I love the people of Caucasus. These are very warm, very sincere, very earnest, and very honorable peoples. And on this lovely note, I think I pretty much am done. I hope this was interesting and not too disjointed.
It's wonderful. Would you mind maybe in the comments after? Would you mind posting the qualities of the Caucasian people, and if you have any source material or links, that would be wonderful.
I do. The problem is majority of them are not in English language. For example, Armenia, Georgia, so forth, the larger diasporas do have quite a bit of stuff, but some of the less populous ethnic groups, Abkhazia, for example, Abkhazians, Adygis, you'll be hard pressed to find in-depth information, especially inside information. And I will post that code of honor. I just want to say that I'd be posting with a disclaimer that the author is basically a Caucasian nationalist. I would like to do Urartu next. It is an enormous, absolutely influential, powerful a culture, like an empire that ruled and glowed and held out in the region that is as old as the Sumerian civilization and lasted all the way, heck, it pretty much outlived the Syrians. I mean, Urartu is not exactly the ancestors of, but in a way ancestors of Georgians, of definitely the Armenian people. I mean, Armenian people today, was in the modern political climate, very much are proud to be the peoples who inherited a lot of the cultural advancements of the Urartu population. These are people who had amazing workmanship of gold, who would write letters on little clay tablets and make little clay envelopes to send them off. Urartu is something that I think really needs to be looked at in depth. So, okay, awesome. Thank you for joining, everyone. It's so good to see everyone again. I really miss interacting with people more. And so thus we have Zoom. Shout out to Zoom, right?
Social distancing. Everybody, please be well.
Okay. Take care, everyone. And seriously, do be well and take care of yourselves. It's good to see everybody. Bye. Hold on, I'm still trying to. Bye, Nathan.
That exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.